Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today we're going to talk about the reasons for climate denialism and how to speak the truth in the face of this opposition. Climate issues are clearly on everyone's minds. The constant weather disasters, disruption of our food systems, sea level threats to coastal communities. Yet in the face of all of this first-person evidence, in the face of what we see every time we open our front doors, people are still denying that climate is changing or that our lifestyle choices are causing that change. And there's plenty of disinformation to help deniers. Disinformation, that means deliberately false information. Scientists in the oil and gas industry were predicting today's global warming issues as far back as the 1950s. This forced the petroleum industry to cover up and deny leaks of their own climate research. They formed groups like the Global Climate Coalition to spread disinformation about climate change. These groups use the tobacco industry playbook. That's the media strategies used by the tobacco industry to deny the link between smoking and cancer. The petroleum industry used the tobacco industry playbook strategies to deny the link between burning fossil fuels and global warming, to deny their own climate research, and to reposition global warming as a theory, not a science-based fact. Then, from the position of climate change as a theory, it was easy to tell people that, oh, this is just a natural climate cycle, that there's really nothing humans can do about it, and that we might as well enjoy our fossil fueled comforts and profit for as long as we can. In fairness, I think the deniers that are actually lying about science to maximize their personal profits, I think that's a very small group of people. I think most of the climate deniers that you and I will encounter, members of our family, people at work, I think that they're just falling prey to corporate disinformation campaigns. And why wouldn't they? In 2022, the oil and gas industry spent over $250 billion on US media, lobbying, and political campaign contributions. That's a lot of money paying for a lot of climate disinformation. So how do we talk about climate issues with friends and family who are constantly exposed to this disinformation? How do we understand and speak constructively the truth to climate deniers? We're joined on Zoom today by Dr. Barbara Easterlin. Barb is a licensed clinical psychologist and a member of the American Psychological Association's climate change community of scholars and practitioners. She's the president of the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting clinicians working at the intersection of mental health and climate change. Barb delivers mental health workshops in support of frontline climate workers and has co-developed a pioneering 60-hour climate psychology certificate program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. Barb is interested in the psychological process of denial and the positive benefits arising from emotionally informed activism. Hi, Barb. You're muted, Barb.
Good. Yeah. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction, Bob.
Nicole Mortellero is a senior science reporter at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where she covers climate change, space, and astronomy. Nicole won the 2021 Kavli Science Journalism Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science for CBC's Quirks and Quarks audio special on the history and future of Black people in science. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Dr. Jack Gorman is the president and co-founder of Critica, a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the public's understanding of scientific consensus. Jack is a climate activist and serves on the board of directors of the international climate organization Green Faith. He's the author of hundreds of scientific papers and books, including Denying to the Grave. Hi, Jack.
Hi, Bob, and thank you for that great introduction.
Dr. Gail Sinatra. Gail is a distinguished professor of psychology and education with the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. She received her PhD in psychology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and is a member of the National Academy of Education. Gail heads the Motivated Change Research Lab at USC and is the co-author of Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It. Hi, Gail.
Hi, and thanks for having me.
So let's just dive right in. What are the causes of climate denialism. Jack, let's start with you. I mean, at this point, the body of scientific evidence that the Earth is warming due to human activity seems pretty indisputable. Yet it seems that people are becoming even more vulnerable to disinformation about climate change. What's happening?
I think all the people here today recognize that the science about climate change is settled science, and that there are so many areas, unfortunately, where there's this discord between settled science and what people believe. In the case of the denial of climate science, we think one of the main drivers is the fact that to do anything on a personal level about climate change is extremely disruptive to people's lives. We are all used to filling up our gas tanks with gasoline and heating our homes with gas and oil and not thinking twice about it. And now we're asking people to stop doing these things that have become part of their lives and completely change. It's necessary that we do that, but people are going to resist doing that because it is very difficult for them. And I think that from a psychological point of view, we need to really focus on what people are afraid of, what they are willing to do, what they think will be the disruptions in their lives if they begin to believe that climate change is real and needs to be addressed.
Barb, what are your thoughts? What are the roots of climate denialism from a psychological perspective?
Yeah, I'm really appreciating, Jack, what you just said about the, kind of the way that the systems are organized in our lives to, promote fossil fuel use, to have 72 degrees temperature in our homes, no matter what latitude we live in, and how difficult it is at an individual level to make those kinds of changes to really move. Yeah, and the idea that potentially, what can one person do here? So I think that adds weight to the kind of the helplessness that goes on, that kind of learned helplessness, like there's nothing I can do anyway, even if I do know that the climate science is accurate and true. And so, there's there's a subtlety to this climate denialism. It's not just sort of denying that climate change is real, right? It's also the defense that comes up around my complicity in the problem. So I feel somewhat guilty when I think about the fact that I do use a fossil fuel driven car, or I could live, I could compost more and I don't, so these individual sort of ways in which we feel responsible for the problem really get in the way sometimes of change, because then what we want to do is dissociate a bit. So we have these psychological capacities that are ingenious, really, to kind of keep us moving one foot in front of the other every day. We can't think about all of the, you know, tremendously difficult things that are going to happen in the far off future. We tend to kind of go back to, what can I do today? How can I take care of my family? And we don't want to think about, so we compartmentalize and sort of split off from what the reality is, partly because there isn't an individual answer, right? And so there's a way in which our culture is formed around not taking collective action on something like this. So I think, I appreciate what you're saying, Jack. I think that's a big root of the issue, but I think that there's subtlety to the defensive structure around this. It's not just outright denial. It's also, how do I deal with my own complicity in this problem? And there are
Barb,
ways to do that. Yeah.
and Barb, you mentioned collective action. Do you feel like the current political efforts to ignore climate is amplifying denialism at that collective
Yeah,
psyche level?
I think what's happening, as far as I can tell, even in my own nervous system, right, is that there are so many issues that are arising day by day. I used to think that climate change was the mental health and existential problem of our planet. Like, if we don't take care of this, we won't have a political system. We won't have, kind of a future to deal with. And now I'm realizing, like, oh, there are many other day-to-day problems that really are pushed right now forward. Like, are we going to lose our health care? Will we lose, will my children lose their jobs working in science, that sort of thing. So I think right now what's happening is that the complexity of all of that is compounding what were fairly straightforward feelings and making them more confusing to us. Like, what is the problem now? What is it that is forefront? And where should I put my attention and energy right now? So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but the
It's
collective
a
kind
big
of,
question.
right? The collective piece of that is so important. What's happening in the environment, in the social environment, in the culture, has a lot to do with this.
Nicole, what about fear? Do you feel like fear plays a role in climate denialism?
In a very big way. As my role as a science journalist who reports frequently on climate change, I get very angry emails, coming back to me. How dare you? This is nonsense. CO2 is good for the atmosphere, all that, the typical things. And I think that fear is also tied to, and which Barb, you touched on as well, and Jack, it's, let's say in Canada, where I am, Alberta is a big oil producing province. And there is unsurprisingly more climate denialism that seems to come from that province. And that fear is because of their jobs. The jobs are so tied to that industry that there's this fear of changing. Even though people are told the more jobs will be, can do it. Just transition is what we call it here, and you can transition your skills to a clean energy and renewable energy. But there's this fear. This is my livelihood. What am I supposed to do? And to some degree, it's very understandable because people feel that there's nowhere else to turn. Um, but I also think that, touching on what you both said earlier, there's this unwillingness to change your behavior, right? What do you mean? I shouldn't drive as often. What do you mean I shouldn't leave the lights on all the time? I'm just one little person. I can't have an effect on the climate. And that's what I hear a lot. Um, a lot, and feedback as a science reporter.
And in my work with the Climate Council is just the opposite. I feel like we as individuals, there is so many things that we can do to not only help the climate, but in the same stroke, improve our environment, live more healthy, save money many times. I mean, so many of the climate solutions cost less than the legacy fossil fuel options. So there's an education component there. And we're all facing these large weather events. I mean, we know that climate change is making the weather events more frequent, more extreme. Uh, Gail, is the need to prepare for these environmental disasters, how is that associated with climate denialism?
Well, yes, we definitely need to be more prepared, but the challenge with that preparation is the denialism in itself, right? So I want to add one aspect of denialism that has yet to been touched on explicitly, and that is identity, although we've all been talking about it just a little bit, especially Nicole, when you were talking about people's, identity tied up with their jobs. So one of the reasons that people fall for the disinformation you mentioned, Bob, is that their identity comes from their identity group. Who do they identify with? Who's their people that they most relate to and most interact with? And people tend to believe people in their group more than they believe science and scientists. And there's been a lot of growing distrust over really quite decades, exacerbated by a lot of the challenges with COVID against experts and scientists and government that have led people to distrust those institutions and to trust more their identity groups. And so if their identity groups are, saying that this whole climate thing is a hoax, they tend to believe that. And so when you are in that kind of doubting or denying or resisting stage and place, you're unlikely to get prepared. Why would you support community events and community resources being dedicated towards climate impact mitigation if you don't believe this is really happening. So that's a real challenge, is we have to get people to understand climate and climate impacts, why it's making extreme weather events worse. And unless they accept and understand that, they're not likely to want to spend time and energy and resources on mitigation.
And you're touching on that disinformation I spoke of earlier, and I feel like we should distinguish between disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation being that deliberately spreading false information for personal gain, and misinformation, which is just repeating the false information, not for personal gain, but just because, as Gail, as you just said, and a friend, an associate, somebody I believe, shared that with me, and I think it's true because of the source. So it comes back around. I feel like most of our climate deniers out there probably focusing in the area of the misinformation. So, the question really comes back to how do we address that? Jack, on the personal level, and I think several people have touched on this, fixing climate change can be seen as expensive disruption of our personal lifestyles. That's contributing to climate denialism.
Absolutely. Almost 10 years ago, I bought my first electric car. I'm now on my third. And I remember very well my wife and I driving in our gas-powered car to the dealer to exchange it for an electric car. And because I'm a shrink, I was analyzing my own feelings at the time. And I was secretly praying that something would go wrong with the deal and I wouldn't be able to complete this exchange because I was terrified of adopting this new technology. At that point, 10 years ago, not that many people that I knew had electric cars. Um, it worked out fine, and now I love them. But I can really relate to people saying, this is very frightening. And when you're frightened, you're much more vulnerable than to be manipulated to accept misinformation or disinformation because you're in that emotional, anxious state. And the misinformation is reassuring. People then come around and say, don't worry about this. It's not true. You don't have to do any of these things. And people feel reassured by that. And that is the basis, our understanding of that, for trying to make headway in reversing climate denialism.
Sounds like a common theme here is resistance to change. I mean, people just don't like to change, so a new technology comes along, or the need to stop doing something because we discover it's unhealthy or bad for the environment. There seems to be a big resistance to that. Barb, how does that fit into the psychology and our personal agency, if you will?
Yeah, I think that along with that is the expense of change, right? So, those of us who are privileged enough to be able to afford, those kinds of, like a vehicle like that, or in my case, solar on my rooftop, or, other sustainable and renewable strategies, that's a part of it too. It's our economy, right? It's sort of like we're at a kind of a breaking point in terms of inequity. And there's centuries of this that have built to this point, right? So it's not, I don't want to go off in that tangent, but the climate crisis is really built on centuries of oppression, enslavement, genocide, extraction, all of that. And the issue of, so that's a big piece, right, of what we're talking about. So it's not just resistance, it's like there's a momentum that's moving forward, and to try to change our behaviors and to shift into at least individual strategies to counter that, that those are expensive oftentimes, and they're expensive at the cost of our social identity, like Yale said. So, if the echo chamber around me is a more kind of relaxed more around maybe finding alternative strategies, I might have people in my life who can help me problem solve that. And maybe, just to borrow from the internal family systems kind of network, kind of like idea, that I could actually dialogue with maybe these different parts of me, the resistant part versus the part of me that actually would like to find a green solution to a problem in my own life, and then maybe have supportive others who could help me make that dialogue, kind of more conscious in a way, so that I could problem solve. Like, maybe I can't do it this year, maybe I can do it next year. But I think if we're in a, kind of a social, and I have people in my own family who would not have a conversation like that with me, who are very resistant to the idea that there is even a climate problem. But I do find that when we approach it in a kind way, and that we're all on the same page about, kind of wanting a good future for our children, having, beautiful spaces that we can enjoy nature. I do think that, that even with the most resistant voices in our lives, we can have those kinds of dialogues. So at a psychological level, though, resistance is really hard to to challenge. So, I'm a therapist, so I deal with resistance every day, in my office. People, it's like, why don't you just do it this way? It'd be so much easier. and people have to come to that in their own way, right? And there are strategies, and sometimes confrontation is a good strategy, to be able to say, I hear you saying that, and yet here is this other part of you that knows and has talked about, a way through. So it's really providing a place, a forum to do a gentle confrontation like that as well, with ourselves and with others.
A gentle confrontation.
Mhm.
It seems to me that breaking through all this information is so difficult. Even within the room here, we're talking about how expensive these solutions are. Yet, in my experience, they'll actually save us money. We talked about the electric car. You're going to buy a new car, you can buy an electric that should be built for the same price you can a gas powered car, and that car is going to be cheaper to operate. The
Yeah.
maintenance, I've seen research studies that are saying the maintenance is like a penny, 1 in 10. You'll spend 10 times as much maintaining all the moving parts on a gas car, whereas that electric is so simple, it will just save you money. And it seems that so many of those things that we talk about that we're ingrained with, that we think, oh, it's too expensive to change. It's really not.
Right.
The investment of upgrading your home or upgrading your car, yes, you don't want to throw away a perfectly good car and go out and buy a new one perhaps, but when you're ready to buy that new car, we need to be looking at those green solutions. Jack, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that's one of the areas in which those of us in the climate activist movement have not actually done a very good job. So we tend, and we should, emphasize the moral reasons for confronting climate change, like the vast inequities that are the case. And we should continue doing that. But we have to recognize that what people care about is how much things cost. They care about their utility bills. And it is absolutely true that sustainable energy is less expensive. Here in New York, we just got told that we're going to have massive increases in our Con Edison utility bills. That gives us an opening to point out to people that this fossil fuel system of heating our homes and running our cars is broken because it is vastly too expensive, and that we can do things much more cheaply, as they did in Burlington, Vermont, for example, where their utility bills are starting to come down because they're converting to solar energy. But we haven't emphasized that enough. We haven't, and that's because I think we haven't been sensitive enough to what people are really facing and fearing. And when we do that, I think we'll get much more traction.
Yeah, I'd like to
Absolutely.
jump in on that, Bob. I think that Jack is right that one of the things we've done is we've promoted a lot of doomerism. And, this idea that it's too late because there's already a lot of change baked into the climate, we can't fix it. So then that doesn't create a real good motivation for action. So I think we've done a very poor job in emphasizing the benefits of changing your lifestyle. I've had an EV vehicle, 3 different ones for 10 years, and I haven't bought gas in 10 years, and that has saved me a lot of money. If you put solar panels on your house, you save on your electric bill. And if you eat less meat, it's better for your cholesterol. So there's an upside to these changes, and we don't spend a lot of time emphasizing the upside. We spend too much time talking about the downside, and there are upsides we need to really emphasize to make people understand that there is a benefit to making these changes as well.
I just want to jump. I just want to jump in there. Yeah, Gail, it's absolutely the case. I joke that at work I'm the doom and gloom reporter because I talk about the science behind it. But my colleague, she is amazing in producing, here's how you can change, here's how you can um, uh, make your contribution. We also have a newsletter that talks about solutions for people so they don't feel helpless. But even when I do write the doom and gloom, let's say I say this was the hottest year, and I'm writing about it at the end, or not always at the end, but I will always try to say, "Hey, but the hope is not lost." Maybe we hit 1.5, that threshold, but doesn't 1.5 is better than 1.6 or 7. So I do always try to, so it's difficult because you want to talk about the reality of the science behind it, but then that you do get that pushback from the going back to that fear, and that fear of change, in your lifestyle. But also, Barbara, I wanted to touch on what you said about inequality. That's a big thing too. So, you know, um, you all have your homes, I'm going to assume. I'm a renter. How can I make changes as well that could help, is difficult because I don't have a say in what I'm doing. But also, a lot of people, um, linking to that, a lot of people will say, I've heard people say, oh, this climate change, that they'll deny it. And they'll just say, they're just trying to get more money out of you. An EV upfront cost is really expensive. I can't afford that. Or, it's same with the solar panels, or even just anything that they consume. Um, for example, we have the carbon tax in Canada, which is a big talking point. And so it has been for quite some time. And people are very upset about that and say it's just a cash grab. It's just a cash grab. But it's supposed to, work so that you're not driving as often, or you're not, because gas is cheaper than water still, and so people do say that it's a cash grab. Unfortunately, they don't see it as something that would actually help the environment, and is something for to work on with climate change.
And again, so much misinformation. Me addressing the idea that I'm a renter, what do I do? I mean, in my workshops and in my books, I'm very focused on all the positive things we can do. And even as a renter, I've got a whole list of things you can do to your apartment to make it healthier and reduce your carbon emissions. A big movement in Europe right now, and I don't want to get off topic here, but here we are. The big movement in Europe right now is balcony solar. They're providing solar cells that just hang on your balcony. You run a cable in, plug it into an outlet, and it can reduce your apartment's electric consumption by 30–40%. There are great positive solutions. And if we can cut through this misinformation, really everybody should be excited about the opportunities we have today. You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Gail Sinatra, Nicole Mortellero, Jack Borman, and Barb Easterlin about climate denialism. So let's talk about more the solutions. I mean, we hear the roots of climate denialism being fear of change, fear of loss, misinformation from our peer group. Gail, let's start with you. How do we communicate more effectively with climate deniers about the risks and actually motivate them to change, to take action?
Well, I just lost my home in a California wildfire, the Eaton Canyon fire north of Los Angeles in Altadena. This was a climate enhanced weather event. So we have annual Santa Ana winds that occur in Southern California, usually 40 to 50 miles per hour. The winds were upwards of 90 miles per hour. And that's what carried the fire so far, and unusually so in our area. So what we're seeing is these extreme weather events, and I think we have to get prepared for those and provide people with more information about how the extreme weather events affect the climate near them I think people feel like these issues are only if you live on the coast, or if you live in the mountains, or if you live in the forest or something like that, you might be affected by climate. But I think a strategy we all have to do is we have to get ready wherever we are to prepare. So look at Asheville, North Carolina. It was touted as a climate haven, and yet they suffered a climate enhanced weather event. So I would say that every area, no matter where you live, should be preparing for whatever climate impacts that you may be experiencing in your community. And in order to do that, we have to move forward successfully with some good information about these effective strategies and what they can be. Speaking about the wildfires, we can bury power lines. We can leave 5 feet away from our homes of non-flammable landscaping. We can build fire breaks. Similarly, there's other types of mitigation strategies you can use in areas that are on the shore. We should not rebuild those homes in Malibu because they might be washed away by the next sea level rise, never mind the next fire. So we need to start thinking strategically about these community-oriented solutions. And you were talking a minute ago about individual solutions, and so we could talk more about those. But those are some community-minded things we can do to prepare for climate-enhanced extreme weather events.
Yeah, can I just say I'm so sorry to hear about your loss. I can't even imagine how terrible that would be. But speaking of wildfires, the 2023 Canadian wildfires, for example, I think I kind of hope would serve as a reminder how connected we are. The smoke was moving across the Atlantic Ocean. We were stifled here in New York City, Jack. I'm sure you remember that. And it's I think these like it was a reminder that, like you said, you don't have to be on the coast. You don't have to be in a forest, near a forest, for these climate enhanced events to affect you. But I mean, do you see, Gail, Barb? I was wondering, do you see people who have experienced these climate enhanced events still denying it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just this morning. So unfortunately, I was sharing with Gail before you got on, lost my house in a wildfire
Oh my
25
God.
years ago. 50 other homes on this area burned, along with 14,000 acres of a national seashore here in Northern California. And fortunately, we rebuilt a little bit about 10 years ago, and for life circumstances, we couldn't get back here until now. So today, the fire inspector came through to look at all of our new sprinklers that we have in the house to protect the inside of the house, the alarm system. And he was leaving. He said, "You passed, everything's good." And he took me out on the deck, and we looked out on the deck. And he said, "I can't leave here in good conscience without telling you that you need to get that forest back." And this is a forest that already burned, right? So it's not a big forest, right?
Yeah.
And I know this, of course, but there's a part of me, it's like, I'm just living my life here, right? I'm just trying to get through day to day. We're trying to get, the plumber to get here, that kind of stuff. And so I think that it's a subtlety with denial, right? Like, I know this ridge is going to burn again at some point. So resilient land tending is a really important thing, like really getting the neighbors on board to really take care of the earth in a way that natural pollinators come back, that we don't have a lot of invasive species that are hot burners. So there's a lot that can be done at a community level, like Gail is talking about. But the idea that people's memory is short, our brains, well, many people, not everybody, but like, our brains are sort of wired in a certain kind of way to take care of near threats, like things that are close to us, not things that are far away. So that's a piece of this as well. But I think as we endure more of this, and people, I think the Yale School of Climate Communications is now estimating that for sure more than 60% of people understand that climate is a severe problem in this country. That does mean that there's a good percentage that don't. But I think that number is moving up. And I think your work, Nicole, in reporting it, and also solutions-oriented journalism that really provides, there are ways out of this, community-based ways out of this, and that we can actually, not only, if we can't reverse climate change and global warming, we can prepare for it. We can develop more resilient strategies as a community. We can build our roads a little higher on the coastlines. We can, kind of take care of heat, these extreme heat events, and take care of our elderly and our very young and be prepared for it. But in terms of like, if you've gone through it, memory is short, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Just because you touched on the Yale climate communications, I'm going to assume you're talking about they did this, sorry?
Surveys.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I was interested so that gives you a lot of drop downs. It says, okay, California and New York, they were like 60% that they, believe in climate change, right? But then when you dropped it down to, I believe climate change will affect me personally, it dropped off precipitously. And I found that really interesting that people, maybe they're not denying climate change in itself, but they're kind of in denial on how it will affect them.
Right. Nobody wants to think about mortality. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Consider
like I
this
said,
room.
I can think about it in the abstract, but my own.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Okay, consider this room. I mean, it's like the guests from across the country, Canada, and we're looking at two wildfire experiences right here in this room.
Mhm.
So I think it's foolish to say this isn't going to touch us at some point, touch us personally. Jack, what are your thoughts? What's the best ways to communicate with climate deniers?
We thought about this a great deal about how do you talk to people in general who are having a problem with what is, from our point of view, accepted science, whether it's vaccines or climate. And we've adopted a motivational interviewing platform for trying to work on this, where we really focus on asking people and asking groups of people, what is most important to you in this topic? What do you care about? And very importantly, what have you heard? What do you believe? What's your source of information? And genuinely being interested in understanding these things so that we really can understand what people's motivations and values and goals are. And very often that's the way to begin a real conversation with people, to uncover what they're afraid of. Do they actually think that climate change is going to affect them? How do they get that idea? Where does that come from? And we work on that level. The other thing we've considered is, what does motivate people to change? So there are technologies that people adopted very rapidly, like cell phones, for example. Why did people so readily give up landlines and adopt cell phones with almost no resistance? Because they were convenient and they work better than landlines. So people like them. So how can we make solar panels something that people like, that something that people think is going to be a positive thing in their lives? And finally, how do we get people to stop smoking cigarettes? The most effective thing was actually raising the price of cigarettes, the tax on cigarettes. So we have to think about what the economic implications are. Here in New York City, we know that the largest source of greenhouse gases is buildings, or the buildings. And so we have something called Local Law 97, which mandates that by 2050, no buildings can actually have gas as their source of energy. All new buildings have to be electric. Understandably, people started saying, how do we afford that? How do we afford to take gas boilers and oil burners out of big buildings and replace them? And the way we have been working on that is to get the city and the state to put money to subsidize this change so that we can actually reassure people this is going to actually be good for you. This is a positive for you. So those are some of the things that we're working on to try to get over climate denialism.
Yeah, I want to pick up
Nicole?
on a couple of things that Jack just said. We were talking earlier about how, and I think Nicole said, gas is cheap. We've got to remember the reason that gas is cheap in the United States is because it's subsidized, and it has been subsidized for decades. And so we don't really appreciate that the true cost of gasoline is really quite high if we actually paid for it and actually paid for the carbon impact, it would be probably $20 a gallon. But it's subsidized and we don't have a carbon tax in the United States and we don't pay for the impact. We pay for it in other ways, but we don't put that together. So one of the other things you were saying is that, the subsidies for green buildings, I mean, we always say we can't afford these things, but we certainly can. We have been subsidizing gas and oil because we wanted to be prosperous and build things and run cars and trains and everything. We did that because we wanted to do it. We could do the other because we want to do it. We could subsidize green buildings. We could subsidize putting solar panels on your house. We have had some of those subsidies. We could subsidize buying electric vehicles. We have had some of those subsidies. So if we make it easier and more affordable for people, as we have done for gasoline, that would be a good way to help people make those switches over.
Nicole, as a journalist, how do you communicate with climate deniers?
It's tricky. Sometimes when the claims are just so ludicrous, I don't. I just don't. Like, for example, the CO2 is good for the, atmosphere and all that. But, I will say, I remember in 2019, I was on a beach in Antigua, and one of my stories published while I was on vacation. And somebody tweeted me something about denying climate change, and they provided uh, a screenshot for Environment and Climate Change Canada, our branch that tackles climate change. And he tried to use that to say, see, they even say it's incorrect. And I was like, no, 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 no. And I looked it up I went to the Environment Climate Change Canada's website. The first line was, climate is changing in Canada, and it provides. So I, in turn, provided them with that information to say, actually, you're incorrect. But it didn't matter, and the person doubled down, and then I walked away because I thought, if I'm providing you with facts and you're still not able to acknowledge it, there's nothing else I can do. And so I do try to have uh, a pleasant discourse with people who are willing to listen. But, there is something in climate communications is a big thing saying, sometimes you don't because somebody is already dug in on their belief. You're not going to change their mind. Um, it's hard to find a person who's a denier. Um, Actually, let me step back for a minute. There are two different kinds of deniers. There's the people that deny that the climate is changing at all, which I found used to be more of the case. Um, and then there's people who are denying that it's anthropogenic, and that it's so that's a different way of denying it. And that's really difficult to try to communicate with people. But the best thing I can do is give them facts. And I do that. I will give them links to their own government's websites, graphs, although I've seen the manipulation from climate deniers of these graphs. You'll see the rising temperature and they'll put a straight line and say, see, it's not rising. And they're very difficult to communicate with. But I just try to be, you know, uh, provide as much information as I can. That's all I can really do.
Well, in our research, Nicole, we have found that, telling people just the facts doesn't work, as you've
Mhm.
noticed. We do apply something called refutations, which, state the misconception, refute it, and then provide the evidence for the scientific conception. We do find that that's more effective. It doesn't say you're wrong,
Mm,
and that's important. And I also want to double down on what Jack was saying, that the start of the conversation should be asking questions of them. where do they get their ideas and why do they think that? And it shouldn't be starting with facts. I'll give you a non-climate example back to COVID. My niece was concerned about getting vaccinated because she had heard from a Facebook friend that it caused infertility. And rather than saying, that's crazy, that's not true, I said, gee, I know that you want to start a family. That's a very serious concern. Why don't you talk to your doctor and see what the doctor says about that and see, because I haven't heard that that's true. Let's go find out. So she did talk to her doctor. Her doctor convinced her to get vaccinated. She got vaccinated and she got her friend from Facebook who told her that information to get vaccinated too. So I think if you start with what's their concern and legitimate their concern, meaning not legitimate the misunderstanding, but if you're scared about infertility, that's a legitimate concern, right? So legitimate the concern, not the misinformation, and then, direct them to where they can get different information and let them find out that different information by themselves can sometimes be helpful. But you are right that there is a set of people who are pretty committed to their original beliefs, and they might not be the ones that are open to those kinds of conversations.
Well, yes, and thank you for that. That's really excellent information. The other problem is sometimes I get way too many emails for me to be able to do that,
course.
angry emails. So, um, but yeah, but that's really interesting to know. That's a good point.
I think that's very valid. I mean, as a presenter, I also get those people that are particularly hostile against climate, seeking me out, coming to my presentations because, they want a platform, they want an audience. And Nicole, you're obviously as a science writer, you're a target for that too. So I think in many ways, we're going to see the worst of the worst, if possible. But I think the question for us here and the purpose of this episode is talking to the people that are subject to the misinformation. And Jack Gale, I really love what you're saying about the motivational interviewing. Is that what you called that? Rather than arguing with the person, find out where they're coming from and let them know that you support them, and then start, raising those questions and helping them move in whatever direction they need to move. Even an incremental move towards acceptance of broader science, I think is a positive for us.
No,
Yeah,
I appreciate everybody here. I appreciate what everybody's saying. Nicole?
I was just going to say it's also, I mean, I've had death threats, because I've reported on something about this, and I'm wondering, Bob, if you have had something similar, because I can imagine.
Yeah, I haven't had the death threats, so
Yeah.
fingers crossed.
Good.
I really, really
Those
sympathy for
aren't the
that.
people, Nicole, that you're
Sad.
going to be able to have a polite
Exactly.
conversation with.
Yeah, no.
I wouldn't go
Really,
there.
really, and the people that have come at me that hard, where it could, I mean, I tend to walk away from those. Even in a lecture, if somebody's just going at me, I usually say, "Well, thank you," and then I move on to somebody else. I was in a presentation on climate a few years ago, and that happened. I mean, somebody very aggressively during the Q&A, and listened, and then just moved to somebody else. Next question. They didn't want to give up. But the interesting thing is that the audience took them on at that point. Members of the audience started engaging with them. And even after the presentation was over and I was packing up and leaving, there was some young men standing there still having that conversation with them. So I felt really good that there was a conversation that came out of that, even though I didn't want to be there myself.
Let's go back to what you said, I think, at the very beginning, Bob, that those hardcore climate deniers that are coming at you and Nicole are a smaller group. And actually, we talk a lot about what we call the movable middle. There are people
Yes.
in the middle that have concerns or confusions, or that, as you mentioned, have been preyed upon by disinformation spreaders. And, it's those people, the ones that have questions, the ones that are confused, the ones that are, committed to this belief, but it's wrong and they just don't know it. Those are the bigger numbers.
Yeah.
If we want to move the needle, we don't really want to focus on those people sending you death threats, because those people aren't going to change. But there are a big group in the middle, and it's definitely a bigger group that really can be moved if they're, as Jack points out, if they're listened to, if their motivation is understood, and if you validate their concern, again, don't validate the misinformation, but validate their concern and then go from there.
You know, it's interesting. When I first started reporting on climate change, would be about 12 years ago, not with CBC, and the news outlet I was at the time had me debate on a local radio station our meteorologist about whether or not climate change was real or not, and the meteorologist took the no stance.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think
Devil's
he's since
advocate.
changed. I think he's since changed. I don't know, but I mean, I was shocked. And so from 2013 to 2025, though, things have changed, and so you know, there's less of that, those hard deniers, and I think maybe that it's that movable middle that you're talking about.
Yeah. I think the
I think
estimate is something like 5% is, like on either side is really not movable. And when you encounter that kind of psychology or that's sort of, I would say, what you're encountering is more of an aggressive stance towards you. That would be the time to kind of ignore that and maybe move on. But there is that movable middle, which is quite large. And it's on a spectrum, of course, but that empathy that you're talking about, Gail, of really putting ourselves in the dilemma with them and then offering, potentially a supportive, direction to go, not trying to convince them of anything. That never works. It hardens the position, basically. Yeah.
So, Barb, I mean, given the enormity of the climate crisis right now and the divisive political situation, is that changing the way we need to communicate with this movable middle?
Can you repeat that, Bob? My internet's just a little shaky.
Given the enormity of the climate crisis and the divisive political situation we're in right now, does that change the way we communicate with the movable middle?
It kind of does because we can't use that word climate too much anymore right now. There's a movement afoot to eradicate the word environment, environmental change, nature, and climate from the vocabulary of those of us who work as climate activists under threat of kind of a sense of like we might lose our funding, that sort of thing. So there has been a little bit of a shift. I'm not sure if that addresses what you're talking about, but I think with the political divisiveness, it's amplified some of the worries that we have that we can't be taken seriously at this point in time. We can't, not we, but that the threat itself is not being taken seriously. And so to combat just the fact that the truth is, kind of global warming is not being, and the root causes of it are not being addressed, but also that it's not a real thing and that that's getting louder, is problematic. But I think we're beginning to see kind of a shift around that. People are beginning to kind of come up out of the trauma, of what this big change has been, and beginning to find solutions and ways to talk about it and find community. So I think the big part of what we do is provide community of support. Like, how are you doing with this right now? How is it going right now? And with that and feeling, the kind of a sense of others in the same dilemma, the conversation reignites again and gets going, maybe in a different way, maybe with different words, maybe with the things that we all cherish and love versus the, worrisome words.
Well, look at how we changed from global warming to climate change, changing those words,
Interestingly enough, that change was actually promoted by a Republican analyst.
Right.
There are documents that have been disclosed indicating that, and given political campaigns, they said focus on climate change because that's less threatening to the voters than global warming. So all of us that call it climate change today, we're basically using a Republican talking point in the US.
That's true.
Interesting.
And we just did a research study
Yeah.
on that and published it. And we're happy to share that you could use either global warming or climate change. We found that with different political orientations and beliefs, those words were both equally well understood. The words to avoid, sadly, are climate justice. And we think it's because in the study that we did, we think that finding is that people aren't clear what that means and don't understand it. And that wasn't the best terminology, but we found the words climate crisis and climate emergency, which we often use in advocacy, also were less effective than global warming and climate change. And so our research recommends using those terms instead.
Very interesting. I will
Thank
keep that in mind.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
very important. Thank you. Yeah.
Gail, talk about climate anxiety. When should we not engage with the denialists?
Yes, so let's start with not engaging with people who are threatening your life, obviously, as we discussed
Obviously.
earlier. And then people who are in it, as you pointed out, Bob, just to grandstand or to make some sort of points, that's not a worthy conversation to have. So you don't want to get into conversations with them. And then the issue you talked about climate anxiety. We know that there is rising climate anxiety, particularly among youth, and that it is a serious issue. And so if it helps people to be active in their community or their school and creating some kinds of programs that help sustainability at their college campus, for example, we have seen research studies showing that those kinds of actions can alleviate some climate anxiety for youth. So that's something we've seen to take some actions can help you feel more empowered and lessen your climate anxiety.
I have a question. You mentioned youth. Sorry, I just want to ask, are you finding fewer climate deniers in the with youth?
Yes, the research is showing a decline in climate denialism overall. And yes, more folks on younger ages are more accepting that the climate is changing. And however, even among youth, we do see differences among political orientations.
That's right.
Jack,
And
what
I think
about
you can
you?
hear me now, so I can.
Oh, I'm glad Barbara's back because you can
Say
talk
that.
more about climate anxiety than I can
Yeah.
probably.
I concur with everything you said, Gail, and along with youth, kind of openness to, with the emerging literature on climate change, they're also more angry and feeling more betrayed and more of a sense that they need help, our help in meeting this crisis. So there, in addition to that, in addition to activism, it's really great when people across generations can reach out and provide support and say, I'm with you in this. And thank you for your activism. And these are the things that I'm doing. This is the way that I'm passing this baton. This is the way I'm taking responsibility. And I take you seriously. So that sense of betrayal in their governments and in an older generation that left them with a mess, essentially, can be, softened a bit when we really, again, empathize, provide support and understanding.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work, Jack?
Sure. So our website at Critica is www.criticascience.org. And for my main climate organization is www.greenfaith.org.
Thank you. Thank you. Gail, where can people go to learn more about your work?
Yeah, you can find out about my book at www.sciencedenialbook.com. And on there is lots of free resources of articles I've written, podcasts I'm on. So you can use those to inform yourself and to inform others.
And Gail or Nicole, where would you send more people to learn about your work?
www.cbc.ca/climate. And there's also my own personal website, www.nicolemortolero.ca.
Thank you. And you'll find Barb's contact and websites in the description below this. Thank you. Thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.